cabinet was split. I think the MAGA base is split. The American people are very split. And I think, the divides are either going to heal slightly over the coming days, or if this escalates, they're going to get even worse. I think it's worth probably going back further back than 12 days, because when Trump was elected back in November, he was very much campaigning on the promise of ending forever wars. That's something that he said repeatedly. And people really supported that. In his first term, he was adamant that America needed to get out of Afghanistan. Of course, it was Joe Biden who ultimately did that, but it was Donald Trump who laid the foundations for that. But this message really resonated with Trump's supporters, this idea that America was not going to be the world's policeman. I think Americans in general were tired of having to constantly spend their money on international conflicts, and of course, huge loss of life in Iraq and Afghanistan and in other places. So, Americans were weary and wary of getting involved in further conflicts, and Trump seized on that, and it was effective. So that was when he was campaigning. And then you fast forward to 12 days ago, when this first broke out in the Middle East, when Israel started attacking Iran. It's worth bearing in mind that sort of the default Republican position, not just Republicans, actually, a lot of the American population, is really to support Israel in whatever they are doing to feel safe, far more so, I think, than in the UK. And certainly among members of Congress, again, a bit less so among the American population. But, Republicans, members of Congress in general, are pretty supportive of Israel. But this was something that immediately it became aware that it was going to be complicated. And, Trump has been weighing up essentially for the past 12 days of how much he wants to get involved. And that has been it's changed over the course of the past 12 days. And we believe that that's because Trump, in a large part, saw how successful the initial Israeli strikes were. And he changed his tune from being, okay, we were informed about this, to being, yes, we were part of it. So he seemed to want to get more and more involved. And that's what we saw ultimately on Saturday night.
And what's been the reaction in the US, particularly amongst his big MAGA base, many of whom are isolationists, as you were saying, very America first? What evidence has there been of any reaction amongst them?
Well, it's really divided his base. There's no two ways about that. On the one side, you had people like Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host, who remains very influential in MAGA circles. He has been adamant that America should not get involved in Iran, should not support Israel with these airstrikes. He took to task Senator Ted Cruz, a Republican from Texas, on Tucker Carlson's podcast, and was grilling Ted Cruz about population size and the Shia Sunni divide in Iran. And Tucker Carlson turned on Ted Cruz and said, you're attacking a country you know nothing about. And Tucker Carlson is very influential in these circles. Same as Steve Bannon, who was in the White House with Trump briefly in the first term. Steve Bannon also has an influential podcast, and he's been strongly calling for Trump not to get more involved in this conflict, to not attack Iran. Bannon says it does not serve America's interests. So, Trump has been aware of this. There's a strong contingent, people who are really plugged into his base, who say that this is not what America wants and needs. And yet, on the other side, you have people like, I suppose, perhaps more traditional Republicans like Lindsey Graham, and John Bolton, who is, an arch hawk, who served again in Trump's White House, and they had a spectacular falling out. But people like that are saying, yes, this is the moment, that we're never going to get an opportunity like this. It's time to do a decisive strike on Iran. And they ultimately won out. So, it split his base. I think there's been some interesting reporting on this. It hasn't caused him to lose his base yet. This is still very early days. Um, I think Trump's diehard supporters still support him, but they're worried. And they are quite confused by this because, as I said, Trump campaigned on ending these forever wars. There's some interesting polling out actually just now, which shows the real divide. Over 80% of Republicans support Trump's actions in Iran, but only 12% of Democrats do. And Americans in general are quite concerned about this. It depends on which poll, but an Ipsos Reuters poll showed that around a third of Americans support this action. A CNN poll put it much lower. They found that 56% actually disapprove of the strikes in Iran. So it's really quite divided the country. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next, hours, really, certainly days and weeks, because if it's a one off, I think that's going to be much more palatable. People will ultimately say, okay, we did something decisive that, for the past four presidents, Netanyahu has been trying to convince, and Trump actually went through with it. So if it's one and done, okay. But if it leads to something far greater, there'll be a lot more criticism.
Would you describe this as a splintering in his support, like a divide between, say, the Republicans in the cabinet and Congress and the grassroots?
I don't think it's that easy, actually, because even within Trump's cabinet, there were dissenting voices, most notably Tulsi Gabbard, who's his director of national intelligence. She, in March, was testifying before a congressional hearing about Iran's nuclear capabilities. And she said that the intelligence showed that Iran was not close to having a nuclear weapon. Well, Trump was asked about this. This is his top intelligence official, and Trump said, "I don't care what she says." Tulsi Gabbard is notably somebody who has argued against American involvement in international conflicts. So she's really been sidelined here. And it's been much more people like Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, who were not noted hawks. None of them particularly were, but they very much support Trump. And once Trump's decided something, they go along with it. So the cabinet was split. I think the MAGA base is split. The American people are very split. And I think, the divides are either going to heal slightly over the coming days, or if this escalates, they're going to get even worse.
And just from a different angle, do you say that what he's doing might actually be winning him support amongst some people that might be, anti-Iran, pro-Israel?
Yes, absolutely. There was an interesting tweet from somebody who served in Joe Biden's team, who said, I am no fan of Donald Trump, and yet I am somebody who can see that he took decisive action at an opportune moment, and I praise him for doing so. So that was quite interesting. And sure, there are absolutely Democrats who feel that this was long overdue. People have been, concerned about Iran's capabilities, nuclear bomb potential for a long while. And I think, in general terms, Americans feel that Iran should not have a nuclear bomb. They feel that is bad for the world. But I suppose they have been divided over how best to do this. And of course, you have the specter of the Iraq war that has been talked about a lot. And, the United States getting involved in Iraq because of what we now know to be faulty intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, an overestimation of how powerful and how far along the line Saddam Hussein was. So people have been talking a lot about that, saying, have we just bombed Iran, carried out these airstrikes on faulty intelligence? And we don't actually yet know. That's the truth of the matter. Trump says that it's the total obliteration. Noticeable that his military leaders are using much more measured language. They are saying that it was a success, and in purely operational terms, it was a success. There weren't any shots fired at all by the Iranians, and the Americans managed to get in and out without losing anybody, without without any downside so far. So operationally, absolutely a success. But whether they actually achieve what they set out to do, we don't know, because it's actually too early to tell whether the nuclear capacity has been destroyed or significantly downgraded. We think significantly downgraded, but in truth, we may never know, because this is buried under a mountain in the Iranian interior. And the fact is, we may actually never know how successful these have been.
And lastly, ultimately, does it matter what the MAGA base think? We're still quite early in President Trump's term, and it's sort of not really too concerned about the polls, I imagine. So does Trump even care what his voters think?
Well, he's certainly got one eye to the midterm elections, which, are coming up, of course, in November next year. And he wants to win. He doesn't want to be the president that presides over a landslide victory for the Democrats. So, the midterms, the MAGA cohesion, that matters on that side. But also, I think it's quite remarkable that that Trump knew, but there was real criticism, prominent criticism from people very attuned to his base, like Steve Bannon, like Tucker Carlson, like Marjorie Taylor Greene in Congress, and he went ahead anyway. So he's got one ear to that, absolutely, but ultimately he's going to do what he thinks is right, and what the advice is from those closest to him.